really trust technology. That's why I still have a rotary dial phone. I can see right away you're going to be a hard place to get to whack. Get your hymn books out, please. Turn to hymn number 214. 214. That's the number of the hymn. See on that? Leading our thoughts in the Lord's Supper. Chris talked about struggle, wanting to be what God is making them to be, and finding, and I'm adding this, but he will agree with me, adding that sometimes he is against what God wants, because that's what we do. And so said to the author of this hymn, John Henry Newman. John Henry Newman wrote this hymn when he was 32 years old. It was a period of struggle for him. He was deeply religious, had been one of the leaders of an evangelical corps of students at Oxford within the Anglican tradition, which was, in his day and time, he was born in 1801, in his day and time was really very deeply pious, religious. A lot of battles within that community, the Anglican community. Out of it, of course, came the Wesleys, their students, their fellows, who believed in certain important methods that God required of us in worship. From that we have Methodist Church. But Newman was deeply religious, but pondering a lot of issues in his life. He was, at this time, a young priest within the Anglican tradition. He was in Italy under great stress and desperate to get back home to England. And in a moment of the greatest distress, in prayer, this poem came to him. And we're going to sing it with the melody that's provided here. 214. Lead, kindly light. Do ti lasso. Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom. Lead thou me on. The night is dark and I am far from home. Lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet. I do not ask to see the distant scene. One step enough for me. I was not ever thus, nor prayed that thou shouldst lead me on. I love to choose and see my path, but now lead thou me on. Light my feet, I do not have to see. I'm going back. The distant scene, one step enough for me. That, the last verse, so long thy power has blessed me, sure it still will lead me on. Or moor and fen, those of course are terms which were familiar in England, marshland, harsh land. Or moor and fen, or crag and torrent, till the night is gone. And with the morn, those angel faces smile, which I have loved, but long since lost a while. Lead kindly light. John's Gospel begins by telling us that in him, Jesus, was life. And that life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness. The darkness could not overcome it, could not understand it, could not comprehend it. Psalm 36:9. The writer there says, "In you is the abundance of life. In your light, we see light." I love that expression. In your light, we see life. Here's the poem again. Lead kindly light amid the encircling gloom. Lead thou me on. Newman at this moment, trying to find the path that he knew God had for him, knew that he could not find it on his own. He had to find it in the light that only God can provide. But he had not done that before. He had been religious, but in a sense self-acknowledging, in a sense self-religious. So at this moment of crisis, he came to understand that to know God, one must have light, and that light is in Jesus and only in Jesus. He said, I love to choose and see my path. I wanted to decide what was right for myself. By the way, when the serpent countered Eve, and of course he lied from the beginning, did he say you were not to eat any of the fruit? Eve said, no, that's not it. We can eat all of it, except one. And Satan said, yeah, of course. He doesn't want you to eat that, because if you did, you would be like him, knowing good and evil. That is, you would have the power to determine right for yourself. That is the sin upon which all sin rests. Do you look at God and say, okay, I've heard you, but hear me now. I'm laying out my own path for myself. Well, Newman here says, I love to choose to see my path, but now lead thou me on. Keep my feet. I do not ask to see the distant scene. One step at a time. One step at a time. I wasn't always this way. I was not ever thus. I did not always pray that you would lead me on. I love to choose. I love to set my own path. But now I ask you to lead me. I love the garish day. That is, I love whatever the world could provide for me. But it was religious. But he did not dismiss the world. I was dismissive of fears. I loved the garish day in spite of fears. Pride ruled my will. Lord, please do not hold this against me. Of course, Newman would come to know that God is not in the holding against business. God is in the business of lifting all of that and making things light, making things clear. What Newman was describing here at a moment of personal stress is something that all of us have dealt with at one point or another, maybe even dealing with right now, for whatever may be going on. But look, Newman coming back to the light of God, understood something, finally understood something. That what he was struggling with has been the eternal story of God's people. The eternal story of God's people. Abraham. Let's begin with Abraham. God called him. He did not know why, but God had called him, so he went. He went not knowing where God wanted him to go. Now, while still known by the name Abram, not yet been called Abraham. He ventured into Egypt. There was famine in the land. And while there, he was given a name which actually was an insulting name. He was given the name Hebrew. By the way, that name is used first in the Bible in Genesis chapter 14, verse 13, when the one we know as Abraham was still Abram. The name literally means wanderer. And in fact, it's not a description of an ethnicity, a people who were Hebrews. It was the name of people who possessed no property, had no known home, and wandered around. And that's what Abraham was. Describes someone who has no social standing. It was a term of insult. But there was Abraham, even though being given a name which was an insult, kept going on. Because God had said, I am going to make you a great nation. There was Joseph. He was sold into slavery. And while he was in slavery, he was faithful to God. He was so faithful to God, in fact, that when a lie was issued against him, he went to prison. He went to prison because he refused to do something that he knew was wrong. But he was a slave. He'd been cut off from his people. But he would not let himself be cut off from God. Genesis chapter 39, verse 9. In that moment in his life when Potiphar's wife attempted to seduce him, his response was, how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? So at that moment, what might have been a moment of isolation and perhaps darkness, he's separated from his people. He still could see light, the light of God. Lead kindly light, Newman said. Lead thou me on. Now, Joseph stayed loyal to God despite the fact that his punishment was unjust, in any legal sense. It's totally unjust. But when time came and Joseph had attained enormous power, enormous official and political power, he was still desperately wanting to find a way to reveal himself to his brothers. You know the story in Genesis. It's a magnificent story, because of what it says about someone who, rather than allow darkness to overcome him, could see the light of God. So he found a way to get his brothers to be presented to him. And he wanted to be presented to him not so he could take vengeance, but because he could therefore show them what God meant for him and for them as well. So, in the story in Genesis 45, verses 4 through 7, Joseph says to his brothers as they are brought into his presence, and he, by the way, is a powerful man, and they were powerless. He says to them, come to me, come to me. So when they finally came into his presence, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Can you imagine at that moment how their knees began to buckle? I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into slavery, into Egypt. But now, do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. They could not possibly have had any understanding of what he meant by that. But Joseph knew what he meant by that. Because in the darkness, he refused to take his eye off the light of God. It was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, to save your lives by a great deliverance. That was a prophecy, the fulfillment of which perhaps Joseph could not himself fully comprehend, because many hundreds of years went by before that occurred. But Joseph, on a path, not sure where that path would lead, having been done wrong, rather than getting into anger, focused on the light, and began, as he followed the light, to see, as the psalmist said, light. In thy light we see light. Moses, called by God, but totally uncertain about his own ability to do what God wanted. In fact, made excuses. But then he finally came to understand something. It wasn't him that mattered. It was all God's things that mattered. Didn't depend on him, depended on God. So with that, he could be able to stand before Pharaoh. Listen, no one in the world at that time was arguably more powerful than Pharaoh. And yet he stood before Pharaoh. Elijah, the great prophet Elijah, in fact, he is the symbol of all the prophets. In that moment, as we read in the Gospels, when Jesus was suddenly transformed, Peter, James, and John were present to see it, and they saw standing there Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, the law and the prophets, and Jesus. There is Elijah, called by God, empowered by God there on Mount Carmel against the prophets of Baal. Magnificent victory for God. And when that happened, Jezebel said, "You will die," and Elijah ran and ran and ran and ran and ran away. Absolutely forgetting that it was God's power. Yes, he forgot. He was hiding. Well, God came to him in a voice. No story could be better. Not in the sound of thunder, not in the sound of lightning, not in a roar, but in a whisper. God spoke to Elijah. Why are you hiding? I paraphrase now. You think you are alone. You think you alone have to bear the burden. Don't you know that I have 6,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal? One of the important things about our path as the struggle unfolds, one of the important things about being in the light of God is that being in the light of God, as the psalmist said, allows us to see light. Elijah needed to see the light. Joseph's brothers came to need to see the light as well. Okay. Elijah needed to see the light. And when he did, never again was he afraid. Now, about all of these great soldiers of faith, if you wish, we learn in the beautiful chapter of what we call the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, I find the very name itself continually fascinating. One of my former colleagues, Dr. Michael Polyakov, very kosher Jew, very pious Orthodox Jew. He and I, of course, would discuss the Bible all the time. His field was classics. He went on to serve in the Institute for the Humanities in the Bush administration. But he would quietly say to me, "Chuck, don't call it the Old Testament, call it the Hebrew Bible." I understood why he said that. And I would say, "Michael, you do know that the word Hebrew is an insult, don't you?" "Well, that's all past. That's all past." But here's the book of Hebrews. This is what we read. This is in chapter 11, verses 8 through 10. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. He did not know where he was going. But he allowed his faith to tell him that if God says go, I will go. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. It was the promised land, but he did not know that. He was like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents like Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs of the same promise. Here's the beautiful verse. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose builder and maker is God. He lived in tents, but he knew there was a city that God had made with foundations, solid, there for all eternity. Because he knew that, he kept going. Still in chapter 11 of Hebrews, by